French illustrator and artist Maurice Joubert de Bec was born in Saumur on the River Loire in western France in 1878. He moved to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in his late teens, and other than the year of his death, that's about the extent of the biographical information I've managed to unearth about this immensely talented but bafflingly obscure figure. His career seems to have begun sometime during the first decade of the 20th century, and the earliest examples I've found are what appear to be some costume designs in pen and watercolour. But by the second decade of the century, he was enjoying some success as a wildlife artist. He was a founding member of the Society of Animal Painters and made frequent trips to Antwerp Zoo in Belgium to create sketches and studies for his animal-themed paintings and prints. Most of these were created using fine ink line work and coloured with a mix of both watercolour washes and gouache paint. His skill with this method gave these images a pleasingly spontaneous, naturalistic appeal. Among other works from this period, I also found a small number of pen and wash portraits and some drawings of emaciated figures in a German prisoner of war camp, which strongly suggested he too had fought and been captured and imprisoned during the Great War. The earliest verified example of commercial published illustration seems to have been a children's book published in 1920, but unfortunately all I found was the cover. But in the same year he also illustrated the sexually explicit book Moyen de Parvenir, written by Béraud de Verville some 300 years earlier. But because of its overt erotic content, de Bec used the alias Maurice Dati in order to protect his reputation in more respectable publishing circles. These images were created by combining etching with aquatints, a technique which used the application of acid on the copper plates to produce a highly distinctive tonal quality. The book was published as a limited edition of only 330 copies, all of which were quickly snapped up by collectors. And he used the same technique but with greater visual sophistication on a series of limited edition prints which were also attributed to Monsieur Dati because of their sexual nature. In 1921 he produced illustrations under his own name for Legend Breton, and this publication demonstrated yet more diverse technical prowess, with a series of illustrations which in this instance were created as bold graphic wood engravings, with an unusual limited palette of non-representational flat colour, almost certainly added as woodblock prints. Unlike the more limited appeal of his earlier, admittedly more expensive erotic work, the relatively family-friendly nature of these images and stories proved popular with the general public, and he followed it a year later with more coloured woodcuts for the book Legend Russe. It followed precisely the same formula and was every bit as commercially successful as the first one. This period of intense productivity continued, and in 1922 he returned to more adult material for an edition of Charles Baudelaire's poems Les Fleurs du Mal. And for this project he also returned to his etching and aquatint combination to create a memorably evocative series of suitably dark and frequently disturbing illustrations inspired by the writer's verses. This was actually the first of no less than 4 books published in the same year. The second was another with its fair share of erotic content, Le Bon Plaisir, written by Henri de Régnier. And despite the erotic nature of the narrative and consequently the illustrations, this time around de Bec opted to use his real name. And although his illustrations and chapter headings lacked the graphic tonal subtlety of his etchings, the monochrome wood engravings were no less expressive and provided further proof of his technical versatility and accomplishment. Pierre Loti's book La Pitié et la Mort, originally written in 1891, was also wood engraved and used a striking limited colour palette of flat colour by de Bec. And although nothing like as demanding as his other projects, the last of this quartet of books was an edition of Paul Adam's novel Lettres de Malaisie, with a series of simple, stylised but effective wood engraved chapter headings. In 1923 he returned to coloured etchings for yet another sexually explicit limited edition of Juvenal's ancient Roman satire on women, and he created a faithful visualisation of the author's reflections about the fair sex, some of which were flattering and some of which were anything but. Some of de Bec's work is far from easy to date, including his monochrome etchings for Cyrano de Bergerac's 17th century fantasy L'Autre Monde, which may or not have been published in 1923. And similarly, I can't find an exact year of publication for a series of 6 compelling seascape etchings, but whenever they were created, they were sold as a themed limited edition to collectors, rather than images from a book. This period of intense creative productivity continued into 1924 with Quelques Amours de Monsieur Nicolas, written by Nicolas Restif de la Bretonne in the 18th century. And for this book, de Bec used his visual skills to produce yet another series of erotically charged but sensitively rendered coloured etchings. Also in that year he published Nouvelles Asiatiques, a series of tales from the East written by the Comte de Gobineau in the 19th century. This book contained monochrome etchings of varying complexity but uniform visual appeal, and for those who were prepared to pay for the privilege, some editions were published with added colour as collector's items. I'm not sure how he could have found the time, but 1924 also saw the publication of his illustrated edition of Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, originally written in 1894. This was arguably his greatest achievement to date. Although best known for the story of the boy Mowgli raised by wolves, the book also contains shorter narratives about the mongoose Rikki Tikki Tavi and the tale of the white seal. But all the images de Bec created for this publication were among the most distinctive produced for any illustrated work of fiction. They were uniformly atmospheric, and more than most visualizations, actually created a more than plausible dense jungle environment and convincing interaction between the boy Mowgli and the animal characters, without resorting to melodrama or obvious anthropomorphic techniques. And the particularly well-considered colour staining of de Bec's expressive etchings lent even more visual interest to this dark, unsentimental body of compelling narrative illustrations. He was almost as prolific in 1925, and Lettres Persanes, which had been written by the Baron de Montesquieu in 1721, was published. And as with other of his book projects, it was published as 2 editions, one printed in tonal sepia-tinted monochrome and another as a more lavish and expensive colour version. And although this narrative wasn't as obsessively sexual as some of his others, there were nevertheless several images which managed to feature some nudity, and the whole book resonated with a certain louche decadence. In 1925 he also published an illustrated edition of Le Conte de Lille's poem Babar, which comprised only 6 separate poems about animals, and de Bec created one striking full-page animal study in heavily saturated colour for each of them, leaning heavily on the images he created earlier for the Jungle Book. Although not his only domain, classical themes were a high priority for the subject matter de Bec gravitated towards, and in 1926 La Grèce et la Sicile was published. This evocation of classic mythology also played to his facility for etching and use of aquatint, and the collection of mannered figurative pieces made for a visually engrossing evocation of the period, and a valid excuse for de Bec to include plenty of incidental nudity, which I think it would be fair to say was his other obvious primary interest. And only 2 years later, in 1928, his edition of Sonica La Courtisane by the Spanish writer Vicente Blasco Ibanez, originally written in 1901, was published, with another 60 coloured etchings created by de Bec. Some of these illustrations were primarily scenic and in some cases quite breathtakingly so, and others were more figurative with closer views. And they ranged in complexity of both composition and application of colour to produce yet another remarkably absorbing body of dramatic narrative work. And given that the central character was a courtesan in this instance, it was perhaps surprising that this collection largely avoided images containing sexual titillation. But with or without erotic content, all of these illustrations constituted a major creative success of narrative illustration. But in 1930 he returned to animal themes with his edition of the medieval allegorical tale of Reynard the Fox. And this was yet another demonstration of his ability to both illuminate and enhance written narratives, and create a symbiotic blend of text and image to entertain the reader far better than words alone were capable of. He employed no anthropomorphic techniques as others were prone to do, and yet managed to be faithful to the improbable allegorical narrative. And the remarkably attractive subdued earthy palette of sepia tones he used throughout the book only served to enhance the medieval flavour of this enduring folk tale. And the popular success of this timeless and highly distinctive visualisation was well deserved. But it transpired that it would be effectively his last published illustrated work, and as such a fitting testament to his creativity and technical accomplishment. In 1932, De Bèck relocated to the coast of Brittany and almost completely abandoned illustration to concentrate increasingly on his painting, mostly of it coastal scenery and other landscapes. But I did manage to find this pen and watercolour magazine illustration from 1934, and from another unknown magazine this series of exotic colour images to accompany a piece written by Louis Guichard, published in 1937. But engaging as they were, they couldn't hope to match up to the triumphant book illustrations he had created earlier. And Maurice De Bèck died of unknown causes in the town of Plougaznou a year later in 1938 at the age of only 60. Despite his fairly short life, Maurice De Bèck managed a career as an artist and illustrator of considerable merit and diversity. And in his time he produced a staggering volume of work using a wide range of graphic techniques and approaches. And I know this is something I continue to drone on about, but it seems to me that a visually creative person of his magnitude and distinctive talent should not have to languish so relatively forgotten and shamefully undocumented. If this video goes even a small way to rectifying that, then I'll consider it to have been worthwhile.